the fire department, totaling $200,000 as a result of increased pricing for our fire engines. We had a similar action a series of weeks ago on the police department side, as we've seen cost escalation across the board for our major equipment. The second fiscal year 23 item is to support the transition from phase 1 into phase 2 of the library strategic planning process. This action would be supported with savings in the capital fund as a result of deferring the branch condition assessment project. It's staff's belief that that project should be revisited after the strategic planning process has been completed. The next item is a reduction in the budget to the Primrose Park project. That reduction is as a result of an acceleration of funding. So back in July, the council accelerated funding from fiscal year 23 into fiscal year 22. This is the second half of that adjustment to remove the fiscal year 23 funding. Similar action is recommended for Ivy Wild Skate Park design. That project was advanced into fiscal year 22 back in August. This is the second half of that adjustment. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Madam Mayor. Eric, you may not know the answer to this question, but I was wondering when the strategic plan for the library is anticipated to be done.
In terms of a completion date, I do not have that, although we can certainly work with our library partners to get that to you. I do know that we anticipate a subsequent IBC later on in fiscal year 23 for the second half of phase 2 of that planning effort.
That was actually the question, okay. And you don't need to do any follow-up, but there's a $75,000 chunk of money that we're going to take off the table to complete the strategic plan. And the question really is that $75,000 going to come back up later in 23, or is the strategic plan going to take long enough that that's now going to be in 24?
That's a great question. I do believe that the branch condition assessment would be part of the fiscal year 24 or later process.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Madam Mayor, I move that we approve the interim budget changes as presented.
We have a motion second. We do have another question.
Thank you. Eric, remind me about the capital fund. How are those funds acquired and collected? And then, I mean, obviously I understand the transfer, but give me some background on how we collect those.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So the capital fund in many regards is an offshoot of the general fund. There is an annual transfer that occurs each year. Right now, that annual transfer is about $12.5 million that goes from the general fund to the capital fund. In addition, electric franchise fees are accounted for within our capital fund. We also do transfers from our impact fee fund into the capital fund for eligible parks, police, and fire capital projects. Those are the primary funding sources for our capital fund. The actual uses in the capital fund tend to be around general governmental services, capital needs, major equipment, major repairs and maintenance.
May I have a follow-up? Mm-hmm. And do we have, this isn't the right word, but the extra funding in the capital fund because of other projects that the city's priorities have shifted from, or is this pretty typical in terms of the amount that's in the capital fund?
Council member, just for clarification, are you talking about the increase in the fire engine cost?
No, I'm talking about just in general, like if we have, do we have an excess in capital funds because we've been saving for something else that didn't happen, or is this the typical amount that we would have every year?
Thank you for that question. When we build the budget for the capital fund, we tend to look at it beyond 1 year. So we develop a 5-year plan. So as it stands right now, our capital plan was balanced and is balanced over a 5-year period. we're currently evaluating, current inflationary impacts that we're seeing and cost escalation and so on and so forth. But right now, that capital plan over a 5-year period is in a balanced position.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Whittings,
Yes.
Bajent,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Thanks, Eric. Next up, Nikki. Nikki Hellenkamp is going to present a document I think everybody should have received. Was it in the Friday packet or just as part of the council agenda? The report that the Technical Advisory Committee from the ULI put together on our housing initiatives.
Okay, going to judge distance here. Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Happy to be with you this afternoon. Again, for the record, Nikki Hellenkamp with the Mayor's Office, here to present on a report provided by the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center for Housing related to the city of Boise's work on housing affordability. So as you may remember, the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center for Housing conducted a technical assistance panel here in Boise in May of this year. It was a 6-member panel composed of 2 local panelists as well as 4 panelists from other parts of the country. During the 3 days that they spent with us, they conducted more than 40 interviews representing a broad base of community interests, including city and other public agencies, social service providers, arts organizations, residents, business leaders, and nonprofit and for-profit developers. They also reviewed the city's existing work related to housing affordability and work together as a panel to craft recommendations. And we asked them this central question about how the city can grow in a way that respects and implements its values. And some of the values that we specifically called out for them to consider were values around open space, around access to recreation, around pathways and transportation, and around affordability. Noting to them that this was a community that historically had been affordable to people at a range of income levels, and that is part of our community's values as well. So we asked them about practices in particular that we could potentially replicate from other cities. And the panel gave a brief presentation about their findings in May and recently provided a more detailed written report, which you have. If someone asked me to distill this report down to 4 words and what it means to me, they would be, don't stop, keep going. And what I mean by that is what I read in this report is that in general, we're on the right track with the work that we're doing to produce and preserve affordable housing, and the work that we're doing to look closely at the relationship between land use and affordability. And we can continue to learn and grow and improve our approach. The recommendations provided by the panel, I've provided a list of the ones I'm going to cover here. What I'll say is that these recommendations are diverse and reflect the various areas of expertise of our panelists. And since they focus on a wide variety of topics related to the city's housing work, I'd be more than happy to welcome questions from you all as we go so that they don't get lost as we change topics. And of course, welcome questions at the end as well. Okay, so one of the first recommendations made by the panel was that the city publish a 5-year housing plan. And this recommendation was part of a broader recommendation about focusing our attention on how we communicate about what we're doing when it comes to housing affordability. Aspects of the recommended plan have already been shared publicly. So when the panelists talked about what they meant by a 5-year housing plan, part of what they meant are things that we have already done and provided publicly. Things like data around housing need, setting goals, and providing updates about progress made toward those goals. But the recommendation from the panelists, which I think we are certainly taking very much into account, is how do we do a better job of communicating this work? So one of the things that they recommended that we were already in the process of doing and will continue to work toward is developing a public-facing dashboard that would provide data about the city's housing work, as well as information about specific projects the city is investing in to any member of our community who's interested in that information. And we're currently looking at how best to communicate our housing work beyond that dashboard, including what that more comprehensive 5-year housing plan might look like, what it would need to include in order to be most relevant and helpful to our community members. So looking forward to some additional work on that front. Okay. The next area was really around building and maintaining partnerships. And this is an important one for us to focus on because I think all of you, more than most people, know that the housing affordability challenges we face are not something that a single city alone is capable of addressing without partnership, right? So really, as we look at partnerships for solutions, looking at what does it look like to partner with our state and federal government, with other local communities, with our neighboring cities, with nonprofits, with the private sector, and with our larger community, with residents. And one of the suggestions that the panel particularly called out was the creation of a cabinet of key decision makers. And they identified the city, CCDC, and the Housing Authority as potential members of that cabinet. What I'll say is that collaboration between those agencies currently happens in an informal manner. The staff within those agencies work very closely together, and there's quite a lot of collaboration that happens. But the recommendation from the panel has sparked some conversation about whether there would be benefit in a more structured partnership and whether those are indeed the players that would make the most sense. If there are folks missing that would be missing from that conversation, what that would look like. So again, spark some conversation in terms of would there be a benefit to formalizing that kind of partnership?
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
a quick question there. Is that sort of formalizing? Is it having a regular meeting that takes place with these different people? Like, what does the formalization kind of look like
Yeah, Madam
based
Mayor.
on that conversation?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, I think that's a great question. And I think that's essentially what we're asking ourselves is, yeah, would it be essentially a regular standing meeting where instead of us talking to CCDC and us talking to the Housing Authority and us going back and forth, can we all get in a room and have a conversation about this together? One of the things that when we had folks from our HUD office come to visit Boise a few months ago, they helped us to pull together a conversation with folks who work on housing issues, not just in Boise, but Idaho wide. And there were many in that room who were kind of going, should we do this again? What does it look like for us to coordinate in a better way, in a smarter way? And is that a monthly meeting? And who creates the agenda for that meeting? And so these are the things that we're trying to work through. And I mean, I'll just say open to suggestions and ideas, and wanting to make sure that any solutions we do create are really responsive to actual need and are of benefit to everyone involved. I think coming back to this piece about building and maintaining partnerships, partnership has to go both ways. And we want to make sure that as we work on our relationships with other entities, that we're doing so in a manner that is mutually beneficial and isn't not mutually beneficial.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikki. Some of the partners that I'm thinking would be ideal to be a part of something like this is Intermountain for Housing, Idaho Legal Aid, the Idaho Human Rights Commission. Something I don't hear often discussed about this is about discrimination in housing and the Fair Housing Act. I think it's important that we include those entities that focus on that. I'm also wondering, when we're talking about housing, are we focusing solely on renters as opposed to homeowners, or are those both in the mix?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor, Councilmember. Thank you for that. I think that it is important to, first of all, to acknowledge housing discrimination as an important aspect of the housing affordability puzzle and the housing access puzzle. So appreciate those comments. And certainly those groups are some that we engage with and will continue to. And in terms of the question around homeownership versus renters, for the purposes of this report, the panel didn't make a distinction between the two. And I think it is important that our conversations about housing and housing affordability and access encompass both. Yeah.
Madam Mayor, Nikki, thank you so much. There's a lot to glean from this. I'm curious about CCDC and what success would look like with them involved. What would change that doesn't happen now if they were at the table?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Council Member, I think that is a very good question. And one of the things that, as we're mulling over this report, we were asking ourselves was, we think that we have a very strong working relationship with both of these agencies and that they are very much at the table. You know, CCDC has been very much involved in conversations about how to bring housing affordability into the work that they do.
Well, and I'll just interrupt you there too. CCDC has been involved in more than just conversations. They've actually funded with TIF funding and sought out opportunities to invest in affordable housing proposals downtown and provided additional points and actually requirements in RFPs for affordability, whether it be the Block 68 project, the project at 17th and Idaho, work that they're doing with us on Fairview, the local construct project and others that they're looking at right now. And that's been an evolution and really appreciate that partnership.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. And I'll just add that when we saw this recommendation in the report, I did follow up with some of the panelists to ask about specifically if they had examples for things that other urban renewal agencies have done that were different than what CCDC has done. I haven't been able to track down anything in the conversations I've had with folks with any kind of specificity. So I think that, as the mayor said, they've done an incredible amount of work in terms of bringing housing affordability into their central mission.
Madam Mayor, one more. Like I said, there's a lot in this report. One of the things that I found interesting that I think we can work on is that the report challenges us to view this as a metro area issue versus just one city at a time. And I've been concerned for some time that Boise is bearing the burden of a lot of different things because we're taking the lead, whether it's homelessness, housing, transportation. I'm wondering as we talk about collaboration, what that could look like with other cities that aren't doing the same things that we're doing, or maybe not at all, and how we can get others to help, be part of the solution. Do you have any ideas on that?
Sure, Madam Mayor, Council Member. I'll say that the report doesn't speak to that specifically. In terms of other ideas, I think there are certainly models for regional partnerships in which multiple cities are able to work together toward housing affordability. The ways in which that have been done vary in their success, but I'd be happy to have some more conversation about some of those models with you. Yeah. Okay. Next up, the panel spent a significant amount of time focused on the need for an increase in supply of permanent supportive housing and highlighted 3 areas of action in order to make that happen. So one of them was a focus on the need for the Housing Authority to provide rental subsidies for permanent supportive housing development, coordinating with the state on a Medicaid waiver to cover some of the services cost, and the creation of a supportive housing investment fund to cover the additional remaining cost around supportive services. So there is work underway, and I know you had a briefing on this recently, so I don't want to belabor the point, but essentially the Housing Authority has stated their intent to provide rental subsidies. The Medicaid waiver work with the state is underway, and the council has approved the proposed $7.5 million in funding for a supportive housing investment fund. So I think that given our conversation around partnerships, this is a really good example that in order to make permanent supportive housing possible in our community, even just looking at this, we need the Housing Authority, we need the Department of Health and Welfare, we need the city, and we also need others to contribute to that supportive housing investment fund. And so really looking at this as an example of where we've got some partnership wheels under us and we wanting to make sure that we can continue that work and to think about other ways in which our partnerships can help us to achieve our goals. The next one is focused on coordinating land use and housing. Some of the examples that the panel gave were around increasing density in strategic locations, incentivizing long-term affordable housing, expanding missing middle typologies, And what I'll say is that these recommendations are largely reflected in the current draft of the zoning code rewrite. The panel's recommendation really was focused on making sure that as we look at land use, we're doing so with the lens of housing affordability. And a sort of minor subset of that had to do with a recommendation around exempting building permit fees. This is something the city of Austin has done on affordable housing developments. City of Boise already exempts impact fees. So we've had some conversation internally around whether that's something on the legal side that we feel comfortable with, whether it's something that is implementable from the building permitting side. And where that currently stands is that the budget implications would need to be explored in order to right size a fee discount or exemption. So that's something that we'll continue to have some conversation around with follow-up likely in early December.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
Nikki, I'm curious about the zoning code rewrite because we're lucky because we're doing this parallel path and it's really historic. And I know that this was happening, before the new rewrite was coming out. My question is it's one thing to say we've checked the box, like we're doing that. And it's another thing to say we're going the distance and we're doing all that we can. And I'm curious, and this is probably another conversation, is there more that we should be doing that we're not in that zoning code? Like we might have touched on it, but it doesn't mean that we've taken all the flexibility that we can. And so I'd just be curious to know what those things are as we think about this from a lens of how do we drive the market to do more of this versus how do we kind of find a middle ground?
Sure, Madam Mayor, Councilmember, thank you. I'll say that, as you mentioned, this report came out before the revised modules 1 and 2 of the zoning code rewrite were published. And so it doesn't go into any kind of detail about our specific draft zoning code rewrite. And I would defer to the zoning code rewrite team on whether there is more that can be done there, since they're the ones who have very much been in the weeds on that.
And I'd just point out that increasing density in strategic locations and expanding missing middle typologies was part of what Tim covered last week in some of the reflections on public feedback, this and other things.
Great. Another issue area that the panel focused on was around preserving affordability. One of the recommendations was to extend our affordability periods, and the panel spoke specifically about requiring affordability periods of 50 to 99 years. So just for context, our land trust properties have 75-year affordability periods. We're currently exploring whether a 50+ year affordability period is possible for other projects with city funds. The panel did note that there have been affordable housing units developed in the city previously that had affordability covenants of as little as 7 years. And that was something that they really emphasized was they didn't recommend, that they really suggested going for a much longer period of affordability. And one of the comments that was made by Stephen Norman, who is the recently retired executive director of the King County Housing Authority, he said, Nikki, I've spent most of my career chasing these closing affordability periods and trying to figure out how to extend them so that the people living in these units don't end up displaced. And if there's something I can really strongly suggest that you do, it's that you find a way to not have the staff here spend their careers chasing these closing affordability windows. So that was something that we certainly are going to continue to look at. And then the panel also suggested exploring additional funding sources. So they mentioned a housing impact fund, which we've discussed before. So an update on that. That work is underway. We've got the market analysis from the Forsyth Street advisors expected to be complete by January of 2023. So looking forward to being back with a more specific update about that then. And the other funding sources that they mentioned will be explored in partnership with our development partners with any of the funding sources will need to take a lead role in that further exploration. Okay, so that's the full list. And I know it's a diverse list and it goes in a lot of different directions, which I think is maybe not abnormal when it comes to the housing affordability conversation. And I do think that we really benefited from, as I said, a diverse group of panelists who had expertise in some very different areas. So we're looking forward to, taking their recommendations into account and continuing to explore how we can improve the work that we're doing. And with that, happy to stand for any other questions.
Madam Mayor. First, Nikki, thank you. And thank you for sending the report over. It's pretty in-depth. It's pretty long. So it's nice to have you be able to summarize it, but also it was really cool to kind of check into some of those details. I guess a couple of things, it's from a transportation lens, it's been helpful for me over the years to see how much funds the city is spending on BRT compared to some of the other cities. And I wonder if there's a similar approach when it comes to our housing. Like, we know how much housing our community needs as a whole, and we're creating a dashboard where the city of Boise is contributing all these different types of units. And it sure would be nice to know what other neighboring cities, like Councilmember Willits brought up, are doing to kind of address those numbers. Because if 50 gets added in Garden City, that's a win for Boise, as well. It might just be across State Street on one side versus the other. And so that's interesting to me, just to think about knowing how much we're putting out there and contributing, and knowing how much other cities maybe are as well. And I guess the second part of that, and this is more of a comment than a question, I guess, is that when we're looking at our dashboard and we're looking at these different units, I think it'd be really nice to know so like, if we've created this many housing and it's on our dashboard, how many of these things resulted from this policy versus this policy versus this policy, so we can tell like what's effective. And maybe some of these neighboring communities can tell, like, here's actually something that City of Boise worked. Maybe it was the building permit fees that actually drove this amount of stuff. And maybe this was the housing bonus thing that drove this amount of stuff. So you can actually tell which strategies are getting the impact. But again, I really appreciate it. And, I would really be excited, like Councilmember Willits said, to figure out how some of our efforts could drive some of our neighboring communities to adopt some similar things.
Thank you, Nikki. I have a question around, so this is a list of things that the city can do, which I think is great, and it makes it really actionable for us. And I'm sorry, I haven't read the report, I've been out of town, but was there anything around kind of adjacencies to what the city can do? So maybe some things that the market could pick up, maybe some things that private business could pick up. One of those things that immediately comes to mind is on the permanent supportive housing side. What if, there are private property owners who rent to low income renters and want some supportive services for their tenants as well? Was there anything like that was included in the report at all?
Madam Mayor, Council Member, the short answer is not really. But I think that those are the questions that you're raising are really important ones. So trying to think through this report really focused in on what can the city be doing? And as discussed on the page about building and maintaining partnerships, we can't be the only ones in the room. And to Councilmember Willits and Halliburton's comments, what does partnership look like, and how do we work with folks in our community, whether they're our neighboring communities or the business community or whoever it is, who, for by and large, we have many members of our community who are saying, okay, what's my lane? How do I define my lane? And so that's something that I think we'll continue to have conversation around. And it is particularly, I think, with the messiness of partnership, I think it can be tempting to focus only on ourselves and going, okay, well, we'll exempt the building permit fees. Okay, that's something. And that is something. And it's something, we should have our own house in order, and we should be doing everything internally that we can do. Absolutely. And in order to actually make change here, we need to be in partnership with others, even when it's hard and messy. And so really digging in deeply into what that looks like at this point in time, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Because I do think that, yes, there are things that only we can do, but I think that there are some other things where we can help to build capacity in the community, in the private sector, to do some of those things as well. So I would encourage us to always be looking for those opportunities, like you said, even when they're hard and messy.
Madam Mayor,
Mhm.
speaking of hard and messy, it's really hard for me to bring these things up, but I realize it's a situation that's bigger than me as an individual. As I read through the list of people involved in this, I had to wonder why the only renter on the Boise City Council wasn't invited to be a part of this, why the only person of color on the Boise City Council wasn't a part of this, why somebody who lost their home to foreclosure in 2010 wasn't a part of this. I just want to have that on record, that I think the people who sent me here again in 2021 wanted that perspective on this. And I know that's not on you, Nikki, but I think it's important to say that, we have those perspectives here wanting to share that information. I mentioned the Idaho Legal Aid. I mentioned the Human Rights Commission. I mentioned Intermountain Fair Housing. I worked for a quasi nonprofit state agency called the Idaho Volunteer Lawyers Program. It's all housing. It's all dealing with social issues that affect people's ability to retain their housing. Moving forward, I would like to just say to the mayor, to my colleagues, that I would like to be a part of these conversations, not just for me, not for my ego, but because I believe that that is why people want me at this dais in this organization, is to give that kind of input. I don't know how I access space in those rooms. All I can do is just say that in public so that it's acknowledged, that if I'm not in those rooms, it's not because I don't want to be. And I thank my colleagues, I thank the mayor for your work on this, but I would like to register that to be publicly known.
I appreciate that. And I just want to make clear that this was not something that was organized by Nikki or staff, but it was organized by an outside panel. So I appreciate your statement and your interest in being involved, and we register that. But at a time when staff is presenting a report that was done by an outside agency, I prefer that be brought to me than provided to staff.
Madam Mayor, with all due respect, the only way at times that I feel that I'm heard is if I do it publicly. I have repeatedly asked to be a part of conversations like this, and it's like I'm a ghost. So I apologize. I hate being disrespectful, but it needs to be registered publicly. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm not saying you're being disrespectful. I just want to make clear that this wasn't Nikki's role. Do you have another slide?
Nope, that's it.
Are there further questions or comments? All right, thank you.
Oh, Madam Mayor, I did have a
Oh,
quick
yeah.
comment. Is ULI are they doing any follow-up discussions on this, or is this the period at the end of the book, or are they following up on any more?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember, thanks for that question. This will be, they've concluded their recommendations. The panel has gone back to their regular jobs across the country. But this is something that's going to be highlighted at the ULI at their fall and annual meeting, I guess semi-annual since it's the fall. So it's something that there will be a session on it. There has also been some interest from other national organizations focused on land use and affordability in the report. We've heard just anecdotally that our local ULI has received a lot of questions and interest from others in potentially replicating something like this in other cities. It's an unusual way for them to use this model. Usually it's very focused on a specific location. So like the county did a technical assistance panel on what do we do with, the LeBois racetrack. So usually focused on a specific parcel or a specific neighborhood. So to do it focused more on the policy side is something that is different for them. And I think it's been an interesting kind of opportunity to learn about how that could be done in the future in other places. So I'd say for us, it might be the period, but hopefully it'll help to be part of some other larger conversations.
Awesome. Thank you.
And Nikki, just to clarify, not directed at you at all.
Madam Mayor, do you have time for one more. Nikki, two things. Well, I guess it's two. Is the Medicaid waiver a sure thing, or do we need to do some more work with the state?
Madam Mayor, council member, we need to do some more work with the state.
Okay, well, I'll follow up with you on that separately. And then secondarily, I talked about this last week. We're a unique unicorn in all of this because we're a largely rural state that has had a massive influx, from a COVID tsunami that was, we were growing before. Are there any other states that we can learn from that had similar experience, 5-6 years ago, had affordability issues, but not like today? I know that the group picked the panel, but are there any other best practices from similar experiences that we could learn from?
Madam Mayor, council member, I think that's a really great question. And I think it's something what I'll say is that we're interested in learning from anyone we can. And I think that, pardon my metaphor, but sometimes I think about it a little bit like having a baby, that when you have a newborn and you've got somebody who has a teenager and you're asking them for advice, they can't remember what it was like when they had a newborn. They're like, it's going to go so fast. Don't even worry about it. And you're like, but I can't sleep. It's screaming. So being able to, so when we talk to folks from other cities who have been struggling with these issues for decades, they're in a different place than we are because they've had decades to evolve a conversation, to get folks on the same page, to try things, to fail, to try again, right? And so we want to learn from them because obviously the people with the teenagers survived the thing, right? But also sometimes it can be really helpful to talk to somebody maybe with a toddler who might remember some of what happened and have some helpful advice, or even other people with infants who can kind of commiserate about the challenges of the stage that we are currently at, not to compare us all to babies, although I just did. So, I think that we're, recently, this coming week, we're going to be in some conversation with some city housing manager from Bend, Oregon. That's another area that, has had really significant growth post-COVID, although a different political environment. We have, I think, had some interesting work come out of Austin, but which is another, with COVID saw a really big boom, but they are also in a very different environment. They passed, I think it was a $250 million housing bond 4 years ago. They're going back again for another $350 million at the ballot this November. So, when you talk about the differences between municipalities that are dealing with the same kinds of issues, yeah, they are quite significant, and trying to find the people who are far enough along that we can really, glean their more recent learnings, finding the people who are really far along so that we can maybe have hope for, okay, this is what this can look like when we figure it out more. It's all going to have to be part of the ongoing work that we're doing. And so, this report is one of many, many ways in which we can learn from others and refine what we're doing. And it provides some great recommendations, but it's in no way, the end all be all of guidance, I guess.
Thank you, Nikki. And I appreciate that metaphor because I got told that a lot and I wanted to scratch my eyes out anytime somebody said that. So keep that metaphor going. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I would like to hereby nominate Nikki Hellenkamp as the queen of metaphors because she has some incredible metaphors that add a lot of clarity around very complicated topics. And this is only the latest example of that. So thanks, Nikki.
No problem. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I would move that we go into executive session, personnel, land acquisition, records exempt from public disclosure, pending probable litigation, to communicate with risk management regarding pending probable claims, labor contract, IC 74-206 1B, C, D, F, I, and J.
Second.
Whittings,
Yes.
Agent,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.